After the prosperity of the High Middle Ages, the Europeans sort of devolved into chaos once again, much like what we saw after the fall of the Roman Empire. To start off with, we have a famine. And this is a famine that lasts for a couple of years. There's a lot of bad weather where there was too much rain that lasted for an extended period of time. We have what's called the Little Ice Age, which sets in. Tons of people dying from cold weather and malnutrition. As time progresses, bad weather sort of only continues, and that changes the temperatures to drop them lower once again, and this causes a decrease in food production. People already malnourished, and then we have the Black Death sweeping in from the east, carried by fleas. And the fleas live on rats. They jump on the rats, and then they would get into people's clothing, into rugs, or just jump on people themselves, and the disease spread rapidly. The disease would ultimately show itself in black swellings, notably like in the armpit or in the groin areas. And the Black Death was certainly worse in cities because of the high population, because of the numbers. Remember, we talked about how big those cities had gotten. Well, that only allowed the disease to spread even faster. The treatment was rather scary because if you were going to get treated for the plague, you were treated by bloodletting, which is the idea of let's get the bad blood out. So they might hold your arm out, cut you, allow some blood to drain out, and then they would stop the bleeding, but they might come back and do that a little later on again, sometimes several times. Or they might just throw some leeches on you. Now leeches, they can act kind of like mosquitoes, and so, or like dirty needles. So you throw some leeches on somebody who has the plague, and then you go to somebody who has a normal cold. Guess what? You now have the plague. Now the reaction to the plague, it sort of depended, I guess, on your state of mind. People were wondering, is this spiritual? Is this spiritually caused? Is God punishing us? Or is somebody conspiring against us? So if you thought that God was punishing you, you might become a flagellant, a person who would attack themselves, like whip themselves, because the idea was if we can take on pain, if we can show God that we are willing to take on sort of his wrath, as it were, will God relent? Will he pull back his hand and take the disease away? Or you have other people who say, you know, why on earth would God punish us with the disease? It's got to be someone else. And so in Europe, the people who are going to be the most different are the Jews. The Jews they dressed differently. They sometimes spoke differently. They didn't go to church, not Christian church. And there was this sort of prevailing erroneous idea that, oh, well, the Jews killed Christ. And so since the Jews killed Christ, then it's okay for us to attack them. And so we see Jews being targeted, even though Jewish people are dying from the disease just as much as what European Christians were dying from. There were these tales going around that Jews were poisoning well water and things of that nature, and so so the Jews are persecuted during this time. The plague does begin to die down whenever the Norwegian brown rat makes his way down into Western Europe. The brown rat is bigger, meaner, and hairier, making it more difficult for fleas to get down to the skin in order to bite. And so the brown rat winds up killing the black rats, and when that happens, not all of them, but you know, a portion of them, and we start to see the plague dying down, but it doesn't completely go away because it does show up in various cities until around about the 1700s. And there was even a case of it a few years back in Colorado, a child played a little too close to a squirrel, a dead squirrel, and she was bitten by some fleas. She was saved, but she lost, I think, several digits on her hand, and she may have lost one of her feet as well. So this is not a nice disease to be in any way close contact with. So we also have chaos not just within individual cities, towns, villages. There's also chaos between countries. So if you remember, during the High Middle Ages, we see, the early and High Middle Ages, England has claim to some French lands. And again, this brings about some trouble. When the French king died with no heir in the 1300s, the English king Edward, who was the French king's nephew, believed that he had a claim to the French throne. One, they've got French lands. Two, he's related by blood. A different man, however, received the crown, like a cousin, and this made Edward very angry. And so we see the start of the 100 Years' War, England versus France. There are new weapons introduced. Excuse me, there are new weapons introduced during this time, which pushed the Europeans sort of towards the brink, moving out of the Middle Ages and moving into what comes to be known as like the modern time. One, we have the longbow, the Welsh longbow. It takes a year to make, but it takes years to actually master it, and this was a lethal weapon to have on the battlefield. But also gunpowder imported from China. At this point in time, it wasn't overly, reliable? It could blow up in your face. But when it did work, oh yeah, it worked. The 100 Years' War was fought sporadically over a long period of time, and there's really 4 phases to the 100 Years' War. As we can see on here, phase 1, England wins. England's got stronger leaders. It's got better weapons, aka the longbow and gunpowder. They also have better military tactics. However, in phase 2, we see a French resurgence. Why? Because there's weaker English leaders. We see the French learning from their mistakes. They have a smarter military strategy. And then the Black Death hits again in England. So the English are sort of preoccupied with, dying. Phase 3, we see an English comeback. The English have a very strong leader in Henry V, Battle of Agincourt and all that jazz. But also we see a Burgundian nobleman aiding the French. He does like a backdoor deal. He does a backdoor deal with the British. A French nobleman aids the British. But finally, phase 4 brings about a final French victory. And this is where we see Joan of Arc providing the necessary motivation. Joan of Arc was around, we're not exactly sure of her age, but she was between the ages of 17 and 19 years old. Just a young girl who believed she had a vision from God or voices from heaven who told her to lead the French army. And she did, and she was successful on several occasions, and then she was conspired against by none other than the French Dauphin, or the French prince, the crown prince. They betrayed her, and she was captured by the British, where she was ultimately killed for witchcraft and I believe heresy. Now, chaos doesn't just happen between people and nations, it also is happening in the church. The year 1054, we see the split, the firm final split between the Greek Orthodox and the Roman Catholic Church. This does nothing to help any criticisms that have been popping up of the church. Probably the biggest criticism of the Roman Catholic Church at this time is the investiture controversy. Investiture, this was the process of investing, if you will, in certain people. So, making a deal to have certain people come work for the church, that kind of thing. Nepotism. nepotism, unethical dealings, things of that nature. So this brings about heavy criticism of the church. And the church, in response, we start to see the church saying, okay, look, we got to have some people who are, acting right. So this is where we see two new monastic orders coming about. One, we have the Franciscans, and two, the Dominicans. The Franciscans followed Francis of Assisi, and they believed that living in abject poverty, by not owning anything, begging for what they needed, and then by serving others, that this would, and also by obeying the church, that this was their act of worship, that this was their act of obeying God and serving God. And so they needed to live among the poor and beg for anything that they needed. Ask, just say, hey, I don't have any shoes, so I'm going to go somewhere and say, hey, I'm a Franciscan, give me some shoes, please, because I'm serving God. The Dominicans, slightly different. The Dominicans believed that education was the way to keep people in check, as it were, and so the Dominicans are very instrumental in helping to establish Catholic Church doctrine. But then things start to get worse. In Catholic Church history, they will refer to a couple of different events as the Great Schism, and they'll name it with different years. I'm going to refer to one event as the Great Schism. So the Great Schism, as we will talk about it, takes place after a kerfuffle between King of France, Philip IV, and Pope Boniface VIII. Okay, the French king needed money. And where are you going to find money if you don't have money in your treasury? Go to the church. So they would go to the church and they would get money. But of course the Pope was not happy about this. And so the Pope said, hey, you can't do that.